The question hung in the air, like a prayer that broke everyone's heart. Steve Harvey stood frozen in the middle of the Family Feud stage, his microphone trembling in his hand, staring into the confused but hopeful eyes of 78-year-old Dorothy Williams. The entire studio had fallen into the kind of silence that comes when something sacred interrupts something ordinary. "Are you my son?" she had asked, her voice carrying the innocent confusion of someone whose mind was slowly being stolen by Alzheimer's disease. "You look like my boy. You sound like him too." 5 words that changed everything. Because when someone with Alzheimer's looks at you with recognition, when their fading mind finds a moment of clarity in the fog of forgetting, you don't correct them. You don't explain. You don't break the spell. You become whoever they need you to be, for however long the moment lasts. Steve Harvey, who had made America laugh for decades, who had faced every possible situation a game show could present, found himself staring into the face of a woman who had mistaken him for the most important person in her disappearing world. And in that moment, everything he thought he knew about television, about entertainment, about what really mattered, shifted forever. Let me take you back to how we arrived at this heartbreaking, beautiful moment. How a routine, Family Feud taping became a masterclass in love, loss, and what it means to show up for someone who can no longer remember why they need you. It was a gray December morning at the Steve Harvey Studios in Atlanta. The holiday decorations were up, casting warm light throughout the studio. But there was something different about this particular taping. The Williams family from Savannah, Georgia, had made the 4-hour drive to be there. But this wasn't just about winning money or having fun on television. This was about creating one last perfect memory for Dorothy Williams, before her mind took that away too. Dorothy sat in the front row of the audience, flanked by her daughter Patricia, her son-in-law Robert, and her 3 grandchildren, 22-year-old Jessica, 19-year-old Marcus, and 16-year-old Sarah. At 78, Dorothy should have been enjoying her golden years, spoiling grandchildren, and sharing stories of the past. Instead, she was living in the early stages of Alzheimer's disease, watching her memories disappear like photographs fading in sunlight. Some days were better than others. Some mornings, Dorothy woke up, knowing exactly who and where she was. Other days, she asked her daughter Patricia why she looked so much like her childhood friend from school. The disease was unpredictable, cruel in its randomness, stealing moments and memories without warning or mercy. But there was one constant in Dorothy's shrinking world: her love for Family Feud. For 15 years, through good days and bad, Dorothy had watched Steve Harvey host her favorite show, even as other memories faded. Even as familiar faces became strangers, Dorothy still knew Steve's voice, still laughed at his jokes, still felt comforted by his presence on her television screen. Patricia had noticed it months ago. Her mother could forget what she'd eaten for breakfast, could look at her own grandchildren with confusion, but when Family Feud came on, Dorothy became herself again. She'd call out answers, laugh at Steve's reactions, and for 30 minutes each day, Alzheimer's couldn't touch her. That's when Patricia had made the decision to apply for the show. Not for the money, not for the fame, but for the chance to give her mother one more perfect memory. One more moment of clarity. One more connection to the world she was slowly leaving behind. During the pre-show meet and greet, when Steve made his rounds, introducing himself to audience members, Dorothy had been having what Patricia called a good day. She'd been alert, engaged, asking questions about the studio, and commenting on how much younger Steve looked in person than on television. But Alzheimer's doesn't follow schedules. It doesn't respect special occasions or important moments. And as the morning progressed, Patricia watched with growing concern as her mother began to slip into confusion. By the time the cameras started rolling, Dorothy was in that twilight state that families of Alzheimer's patients know too well. Present, but not present. Aware, but not aware. Looking at familiar faces with the expression of someone trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. The Williams family had been selected to compete against the Rodriguez family from Miami, and the game started with typical Family Feud energy. Patricia, Robert, Jessica, Marcus, and Sarah played with enthusiasm, but their attention was divided. Half their focus was on the game, half on Dorothy, watching for signs that she was becoming distressed or more confused. Steve, with his instinct for reading people, had noticed Dorothy immediately. Something about her demeanor, the way she watched him with such intensity, had caught his attention. During commercial breaks, he found himself glancing toward the audience, checking on the elderly woman who seemed to be studying him with a mixture of recognition and confusion. The game progressed through 3 rounds, with the Williams family maintaining a solid lead. Steve was in his element, making jokes about the family's answers, working the crowd with his usual charm. But he kept returning to Dorothy, something about her presence, drawing his attention like a magnet. It was during the 4th round that everything changed. The survey question was, name someone you never want to forget. Sarah Williams, Dorothy's youngest granddaughter, had just given a beautiful answer, my grandmother. The response earned the number 2 spot on the board and sent the family into celebration mode. But as the applause died down and Steve prepared to move to the next question, he heard a voice from the audience. "Excuse me," Dorothy called out, her voice carrying the clarity that sometimes emerges from confusion. "Excuse me, young man." The studio began to quiet as people realized someone in the audience was speaking. Steve turned toward Dorothy, his showman's instincts telling him to handle this quickly and get back to the game. But when he saw her face, something made him pause. Dorothy was looking directly at him, with an expression of recognition so pure, so certain, that it stopped him cold. This wasn't the confused gaze of someone lost in Alzheimer's fog. This was the look of someone who had found exactly what they were looking for. "Ma'am," Steve said, his voice gentler now, more personal. Dorothy stood up slowly, her family immediately moving to support her, but she waved them away with the kind of gentle authority that mothers never lose, no matter what disease might be stealing their memories. "I need to ask you something," she said, her voice growing stronger as she spoke, "and I need you to be honest with me." Steve felt something shift in his chest. The studio around him seemed to fade away until there was only this moment, this woman, and whatever truth she was about to share. "What do you need to ask me?" Steve said, and everyone who heard him could tell that this was no longer game show banter. This was one human being genuinely responding to another. Dorothy took a step closer to the stage, her eyes never leaving Steve's face. When she spoke, her words carried the weight of someone grasping for something just beyond their reach. "Are you my son?" she asked, and the question hung in the air like a prayer. "You look like my boy. You sound like him too. I've been watching you, and I know you. I know your voice. I know your laugh. Are you my Dave?" The studio fell into absolute silence. Not the kind of quiet that comes from surprise or shock, but the deeper silence that settles when everyone in a room realizes they're witnessing something sacred, something that transcends entertainment and touches the very core of what it means to be human. Steve Harvey, who had hosted thousands of hours of television, who had faced every conceivable situation a game show could present, found himself in completely uncharted territory. Because Dorothy wasn't asking if he was Steve Harvey, she was asking if he was David, her son who had died in a car accident 23 years ago, the loss that had shaped the rest of her life. In that moment, Steve had a choice. He could gently correct her, explain who he really was, bring her back to reality, or he could do something else entirely. Steve Harvey looked into the hopeful eyes of a woman whose mind was being stolen, piece by piece, and he made the most compassionate decision of his career. "Yes," he said simply, his voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Mama, I'm here." The words hit the studio like a physical force. Patricia Williams brought her hands to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. The Williams grandchildren stood frozen, watching their grandmother's face transform with a joy they hadn't seen in months. Audience members throughout the studio began to cry, not from sadness, but from witnessing love in its purest form. Dorothy's entire being seemed to light up. The confusion that had clouded her features disappeared, replaced by the radiant smile of a mother who had found her lost child. "I knew it," she said, her voice filled with triumph and relief. "I knew it was you. You got so tall, baby, and look at that suit. So handsome." Steve descended from the stage without hesitation, walking directly to Dorothy. When he reached her, he did something that no game show host in television history had ever done. He knelt down, took her hands in his, and allowed himself to become whoever she needed him to be. "I'm here, Mama," he said again, and his voice carried 23 years of grief for a son who would never come home, filtered through the love of a stranger who understood that some gifts are too precious to refuse. Dorothy reached out and touched Steve's face with trembling fingers, tracing his features like she was memorizing them. "You were gone so long, David. I was worried about you." "I'm okay, Mama," Steve whispered. "I'm right here now." Behind the scenes, the production team faced a decision unlike any they'd ever encountered. Do they cut to commercial? Do they stop rolling? Do they interrupt this moment for the sake of television protocol? But everyone in that control room understood that they were witnessing something that transcended their medium. This wasn't about entertainment anymore. This was about a dying woman's mind giving her one last gift, the return of her beloved son. Dorothy looked around the studio with wonder. "All these people came to see you, David. You must be doing something important." "I am, Mama," Steve said, his voice steady despite the tears flowing down his face. "I'm helping people. I'm making them happy. Just like you taught me." Dorothy beamed with pride. "That's my boy. I always knew you'd do something special." She turned to Patricia, who was crying so hard she could barely breathe. "Patricia, look. David came home. I told you he would come home." Patricia, who had watched her mother grieve her brother's death for over 2 decades, who had seen Alzheimer's steal almost everything else, nodded through her tears. "I see him, Mama. He's here." Steve stood up slowly, and without thinking about cameras or audiences or anything except the woman in front of him, wrapped Dorothy in the kind of hug a son gives his mother. Not performance, not show business, just pure human connection, born from the understanding that some moments are too sacred to waste on anything but love. Dorothy melted into the embrace, and for those few seconds, her world was complete again. Her son was home. Her family was whole. The devastating loss that had defined the last quarter century of her life had been healed, at least for this moment. When they separated, Dorothy looked up at Steve with eyes bright with joy and said the words that would haunt and heal him for the rest of his life. "Don't leave me again, David. Promise me you won't leave me again." Steve Harvey, who had made his career on words, who had always known what to say in any situation, found his voice breaking as he made a promise he knew he couldn't keep, but couldn't bear not to make. "I promise, Mama, I'll never leave you again." The Williams family, the Rodriguez family, the studio audience, the crew members, everyone present, understood that they had just witnessed something that could never be scripted, never be planned, never be replicated. They had seen love transcend time, death, and disease. They had watched as a stranger became family simply by choosing compassion over truth. The game resumed eventually, but it was unlike any Family Feud episode ever recorded. Dorothy remained alert and present for the rest of the taping, cheering for her son and his show, beaming with pride every time he spoke. The Williams family played with hearts full of gratitude, not for any money they might win, but for the gift Steve had given their matriarch. When the Williams family won the game and the $20,000 grand prize, Dorothy clapped louder than anyone. "That's my boy," she kept saying. "That's my David." As the celebration concluded and the audience began to disperse, Steve approached Dorothy one final time. He knelt beside her chair and spoke softly, intimately, in words that only she could hear. "I love you, Mama," he said, "and I'm proud to be your son." Dorothy cupped his face in her hands. "One more time. I love you too, baby. You make your mama so proud." The episode aired 6 weeks later, but it was unlike anything Family Feud had ever broadcast. The network kept the raw footage largely intact, understanding that what they had captured was more valuable than any edited entertainment could ever be. It became the most watched episode in the show's history. Not because of the game, but because viewers witnessed something increasingly rare: unconditional love, given freely to a stranger. Dorothy Williams passed away peacefully 4 months after the taping. In her final weeks, when Alzheimer's had stolen almost everything else, she still remembered her son David coming to see her on television. She would tell anyone who would listen about how proud she was of him, how handsome he looked in his suit, how he promised never to leave her again. At Dorothy's funeral, which Steve attended along with the entire Williams family, Patricia spoke about the gift her mother had been given in her final months. For 23 years, Mama grieved for David, she said, but thanks to Steve Harvey, she got to spend her last good days believing her son had come home. She died happy, complete, believing she was loved by the child she lost. Steve spoke at the service, his voice steady but emotional. Dorothy taught me that love doesn't require blood. It doesn't require history. It doesn't even require memory. Love just requires someone to be willing to show up, to be present, to become whatever someone else needs them to be. The Williams family established a tradition in Dorothy's honor. Every year on the anniversary of that episode, they gather to watch Family Feud together, remembering the day a game show host became family, the day love conquered confusion, the day Steve Harvey proved that the most powerful television happens when you stop being a performer and start being human. And Steve Harvey, he learned something that day that changed how he approaches every show, every interaction, every moment he spends in the public eye. He learned that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone isn't the truth. Sometimes it's allowing them to live in a moment of joy, even if that moment is built on a beautiful misunderstanding. Dorothy's story became more than just a television moment. It became a reminder that love shows up in the most unexpected ways, that family is defined by choice as much as blood, and that sometimes the most meaningful connections happen between strangers who choose to see each other as something more. Because sometimes a confused question from an Alzheimer's patient can teach a game show host about the true meaning of family. Sometimes a gentle lie is the most loving truth, and sometimes the most beautiful moments happen when we choose to become whoever someone else needs us to be, for however long they need us to be it. In her final days, Dorothy Williams believed her son had come home. Steve Harvey, who had started that day as a game show host, discovered he had become something infinitely more precious: a son, a memory, a moment of peace in a mind being slowly stolen by disease. And that gift, given freely and without condition, became the most meaningful role he would ever play.